The fastest way to change your life isn't falling in love. It's saying yes before you're ready. I didn't know those words would become the truest thing I'd ever lived through. 3 days before everything changed, I was sitting inside my 10-year-old Honda Civic, staring at an eviction notice folded across my steering wheel. My apartment lease had officially ended that morning. My savings account showed less than $80. My phone battery hovered at 12%, and my stomach reminded me I had skipped both breakfast and lunch to make my last grocery run stretch another day. At 27, I had imagined my life would look different. I loved taking care of children, but temporary nanny jobs barely covered rent, and every family I worked for eventually moved away, hired relatives, or decided they no longer needed help. I kept telling myself something better would come along. Hope was getting expensive. Rain tapped softly against my windshield as I refreshed the job listings for what felt like the 100th time. Most openings paid barely enough to survive in New York. Then one listing appeared at the top of the page. Live-in nanny. Immediate start. Private estate in Westchester County. Salary far above anything I had ever seen. Housing included. Medical benefits. Transportation provided. The requirements were strangely simple. Experience with children. Flexible schedule. Absolute discretion. I read the description 3 times, convinced I had missed the catch. There wasn't one. No company name. No family name. Only a phone number and a note that interviews would happen the same afternoon. 2 hours later, I found myself standing outside a quiet office building overlooking the Hudson River. Everything inside looked polished without feeling flashy. A woman in her 50s welcomed me with a warm smile that somehow revealed almost nothing. She asked about my childcare experience, my certifications, my emergency training, and what I believed children needed most. I answered honestly. Stability. Patience. Someone who keeps showing up. She nodded slowly before sliding a contract across the desk. I noticed the salary again and almost laughed because it felt unreal. The family values privacy, she said calmly. You'll receive the address after signing. I hesitated for exactly 5 seconds. 5 seconds between fear and survival. Then I picked up the pen. By sunset, I was driving through towering iron gates toward the largest house I had ever seen outside of a movie. Stone walls stretched farther than I could measure. Security cameras followed every turn. Perfect gardens surrounded a mansion glowing beneath golden lights. A housekeeper greeted me before leading me inside, where every hallway echoed with a strange kind of silence. No music, no laughter, just quiet. Then I heard small footsteps racing down a staircase. A little boy with bright blue eyes stopped in front of me, holding the hand of a little girl clutching a stuffed rabbit. They smiled like they had been waiting for someone for a very long time. I smiled back, believing I had finally found the fresh start I desperately needed. I had no idea whose home I had just entered. I woke before sunrise because unfamiliar places have always made sleep feel temporary. The bedroom they had prepared for me was larger than my entire apartment had been, with tall windows overlooking acres of perfectly trimmed gardens wrapped in early morning mist. Everything smelled faintly of fresh linen and polished wood. It should have felt peaceful, yet something about the silence kept my shoulders tense. Most homes with children woke up noisy. This one seemed to hold its breath. I found Liam already sitting at the kitchen island with a bowl of cereal he had barely touched. Sophie sat beside him coloring quietly with a box of crayons that looked almost brand new. Neither child argued. Neither complained. They simply smiled when they saw me, as though they had been hoping I would come back downstairs. "Good morning, Miss Claire," Liam said politely. It sounded rehearsed, almost too careful for an 8-year-old. "Can we have breakfast together?" I smiled and rolled up the sleeves of my sweater. "I think pancakes sound better than cold cereal." Sophie's eyes lit up with excitement, and for the first time since arriving, I heard a tiny laugh echo through the enormous kitchen. The housekeeper standing nearby looked genuinely surprised before lowering her eyes and quietly leaving the room. Within half an hour, flour dust covered the counter. Sophie accidentally cracked an egg into the mixing bowl, shell and all, and Liam insisted blueberries belonged in every pancake because his mother used to make them that way. The moment the words left his mouth, the kitchen became quiet again. He stared at the batter while Sophie reached for his hand without saying anything. I pretended not to notice and simply kept stirring. Children always revealed their hearts in the smallest moments. By late afternoon, we were reading stories in the family library when I heard engines approaching from somewhere beyond the front gates. One vehicle became several. The distant hum grew louder until it settled into a steady rhythm outside the mansion. Liam immediately closed his book. Sophie climbed off the couch and straightened her dress. Neither child looked frightened. They looked prepared. Every employee in the house suddenly moved with quiet efficiency. A butler adjusted his jacket. Two housekeepers stepped into the hallway. Even the security staff outside the windows stood a little straighter. Curiosity tugged at me, but I stayed where I was until Liam looked toward the entrance and whispered, "Daddy is home." I followed them into the grand foyer just as the massive front doors opened. Cool evening air drifted inside. Several men in tailored dark suits entered first, scanning the room with calm professionalism before stepping aside. Then he walked in, tall, composed, wearing a charcoal overcoat over a perfectly fitted suit. His dark hair was neatly combed back, and his steady blue eyes quietly observed everything around him before settling on his children. The entire room seemed to pause without anyone saying a word. Sophie let go of my hand and ran toward him. He caught her effortlessly, lifting her into his arms with practiced ease before resting a gentle kiss against her forehead. Liam followed a second later, receiving the same quiet smile. It was only then that the housekeeper beside me leaned closer and whispered words that made my heartbeat stumble. "Welcome to the Moretti estate, Miss Bennett. That is Mr. Ethan Moretti." My instinct told me to leave before I became part of something I did not understand. I had heard the Moretti name before. Everyone in New York had. Not through conversations with friends or headlines that said too much, but through whispers that always stopped the moment someone noticed another person listening. Standing in that grand foyer, watching Ethan Moretti gently set Sophie back on the marble floor before smoothing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, nothing matched the stories my imagination had built. He looked less like a monster and more like a man carrying a weight no one else could see. That somehow unsettled me even more. Ethan's eyes finally met mine. They were calm, impossibly observant, the kind of eyes that noticed details before words were ever spoken. "Miss Bennett," he said in a steady voice. "Thank you for accepting this position on such short notice." I nodded politely, suddenly aware that my palms felt cold. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Moretti." He glanced toward Liam and Sophie before returning his attention to me. "Have they caused you any trouble?" "None at all," I answered honestly. "They have been wonderful." Something softened in his expression for only a second before disappearing behind the same composed face. "Good." That single word carried quiet relief. Dinner was served shortly afterward in a dining room large enough to host dozens of guests, yet only 4 places had been prepared. I expected Ethan to sit at one end of the long table, far from everyone else. Instead, he chose the chair between Liam and Sophie. They immediately began telling him about pancakes, coloring books, and the tower we had built from wooden blocks that afternoon. He listened carefully to every sentence, even the ones that wandered nowhere. I found myself smiling without realizing it. Then I noticed something else. Every few minutes, Ethan glanced toward me, not long enough to be uncomfortable, but almost as if he were measuring how naturally the children interacted with me. After dinner, the children begged me to read one more story before bedtime. Ethan quietly agreed and disappeared into another part of the house. Nearly an hour later, after Liam and Sophie had finally fallen asleep, I walked downstairs planning to ask the housekeeper about my schedule for the week. Instead, I found Ethan standing alone beside the library fireplace, reading documents spread across a polished wooden desk. He looked up before I could apologize for interrupting. "The children laughed today," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," I replied. "Children usually do when they feel comfortable." He remained silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. It has been a long time since this house sounded like that. I did not know how to answer. Finally, I gathered enough courage to ask the question that had been sitting in my chest all evening. "Why was I never told who you were before I signed the contract?" Ethan closed the folder in front of him with deliberate calm. "Because most people refuse the job the moment they hear my name." My heart sank. I took a slow breath before speaking. "I think it would be better if I left tomorrow morning." Before Ethan could answer, small footsteps echoed from the staircase. Liam stood there clutching the railing, his sleepy blue eyes fixed on me. "Please do not go," he whispered. "Everyone else always leaves." I looked at Liam for several long seconds before I answered. His small hands gripped the wooden railing tightly, and despite the sleep still clouding his eyes, I could see something much heavier than exhaustion. It was disappointment he already expected to feel. No child should become familiar with goodbye. I walked toward the staircase slowly until I was standing only a few feet away. "I have not left yet," I said softly. "How about we worry about tomorrow when tomorrow gets here?" His shoulders relaxed just enough for me to notice. Sophie appeared behind him a moment later, rubbing one eye while holding her stuffed rabbit close to her chest. "Can Miss Claire make pancakes again?" she whispered. I smiled despite everything. "Only if both of you promise to help." She nodded so enthusiastically that her rabbit nearly slipped from her arms. Ethan remained near the fireplace without interrupting. When the children finally returned upstairs, he watched them disappear before speaking again. "You are free to leave whenever you choose," he said quietly. "But if you stay, you will only be responsible for being yourself with them. Nothing more." There was no pressure in his voice, no attempt to convince me. Somehow that honesty made the decision even harder. The next morning began with sunlight pouring through the kitchen windows instead of silence. Liam insisted on measuring flour, while Sophie proudly declared herself the official blueberry inspector. By the time breakfast was finished, both children had flour on their noses and laughter filled every corner of the room. Several members of the household staff paused briefly in the hallway, exchanging surprised smiles before continuing with their work. It felt as though the house itself had been asleep for years and was only beginning to wake. After breakfast, we explored the enormous backyard. There were gardens, walking paths, a small pond, and an old tree with a wooden swing hanging from one thick branch. Liam admitted he had never actually used it because nobody ever had time to push him. So I did. His laughter echoed across the property while Sophie clapped every time he soared a little higher. I noticed movement from an upstairs window and looked up. Ethan stood in his office, one hand resting against the glass as he watched his children below. He did not smile broadly. He barely smiled at all. Yet something in his face had changed. It was almost as though he had remembered a version of himself he thought had disappeared. Later that afternoon, rain rolled in without warning, sending us running back toward the mansion. We arrived completely soaked, laughing so hard none of us cared. Sophie sneezed dramatically, making Liam laugh even harder. I wrapped both children in oversized towels while the housekeeper hurried over with warm cocoa. Ethan entered the foyer just then, stopping when he saw the three of us standing there with damp hair, muddy shoes, and smiling faces. His eyes moved from the children to me before settling on the mugs of hot chocolate in our hands. "Looks like you survived the storm," he said. Liam grinned. It was fun because Miss Claire stayed outside with us. Ethan looked at me for a quiet moment before speaking in a voice so low only I could hear. "You have done more for this house in 2 days than money ever could." The days settled into a rhythm that felt surprisingly ordinary despite the extraordinary place where I now lived. Every morning began with breakfast around the kitchen island instead of the formal dining room. Liam insisted on packing his own school bag, even though he checked it 3 different times before leaving. Sophie never remembered where she had left her favorite stuffed rabbit until the last possible minute. They were simply children, not the mysterious figures I had imagined when I first arrived. I began to understand that the enormous mansion had never been missing expensive things. It had been missing ordinary moments. One Tuesday afternoon, after finishing homework, I found an old recipe box tucked away in one of the kitchen cabinets. Most of the cards were handwritten, stained with flour and vanilla. Sophie carefully traced one faded signature with her tiny finger. "Mom wrote these," she whispered. Liam grew unusually quiet beside her. I looked at the cards before smiling gently. "Then maybe we should make one of her recipes together." They exchanged uncertain glances before nodding. An hour later, the kitchen smelled like warm cinnamon and fresh apples. Flour covered the countertops again, and Sophie somehow managed to leave tiny handprints across one cabinet door. Liam laughed so hard that he accidentally dropped an apple slice into the mixing bowl instead of the pie filling. For the first time since I had met them, they spoke about their mother without lowering their voices. They shared stories about bedtime songs, birthday cakes, and family movie nights. They laughed between memories instead of crying through them. As the pie baked, I stepped into the hallway to wash my hands and nearly froze. Ethan stood just beyond the doorway, completely unnoticed by the children. He had apparently been there for several minutes. His attention was not on me. It was entirely on the sound of his son and daughter laughing together. His expression remained composed, yet his eyes carried something painfully human. Gratitude, regret, relief. Maybe all three. Neither of us spoke. Words would have interrupted something too fragile to touch. That evening, after the children were asleep, I found a small box waiting outside my bedroom door. Inside was a simple leather notebook, high-quality colored pencils, and a handwritten note in careful lettering. For the children. You seem to help them express what they cannot always say. Thank you. There was no signature, but none was necessary. The next afternoon, Liam surprised me by asking if we could draw together before dinner. Sophie eagerly joined us on the library floor. Soon, colorful sketches covered nearly every page of the new notebook. Liam drew the giant oak tree outside. Sophie drew pancakes that looked more like smiling clouds. When I asked if they wanted to add one more picture before dinner, Liam hesitated before carefully sketching 4 people standing beneath the same tree. I recognized the children immediately. Ethan stood beside them. Then Liam quietly handed me the pencil. "You forgot yourself," he said with complete innocence. Before I could answer, footsteps echoed outside the library. Ethan stopped in the doorway and looked down at the drawing resting in Liam's lap. For several silent seconds, nobody moved. Then Liam held up the picture proudly and smiled. "Now it finally looks like home." Life inside the estate continued to feel calmer than the stories I had once imagined, but small changes began appearing around us like clouds gathering before a storm. Security guards who usually smiled politely at Liam and Sophie suddenly spoke into earpieces more often. The front gate remained closed longer than usual whenever a vehicle arrived. Deliveries were inspected with unusual care before they crossed the property. Nobody explained why, yet everyone seemed to know something had changed. I tried not to let the children notice. We spent our afternoons building blanket forts in the family room, reading adventure novels, and planting colorful flowers beside the old swing in the backyard. Liam proudly declared that every flower deserved a name. Sophie insisted butterflies like people who sang to them. I sang anyway, even though I knew my voice was far from perfect. They laughed so hard that I forgot the quiet tension lingering around the house. One afternoon, we drove to a nearby children's museum with 2 members of the security team following several steps behind. Liam was fascinated by the science exhibits, while Sophie spent nearly an hour inside the art room, covering a paper crown with glitter. As we prepared to leave, I noticed one of the guards speaking urgently into a radio before another quietly suggested we return to the vehicle immediately because the schedule had changed. His tone remained calm, but something about the way he continuously scanned the parking lot made my heartbeat quicken. I kept smiling for the children, encouraging them to race me back to the SUV. They thought it was another game. I wanted it to stay that way. The drive home felt unusually quiet. Ethan was already waiting when we arrived. He crouched beside Sophie before brushing a loose curl away from her face, then placed one reassuring hand on Liam's shoulder. Only after both children disappeared inside with the housekeeper did he look toward the head of security. Their conversation happened far enough away that I could not hear a single word, but I noticed the concern in every expression surrounding them. Later that evening, after the children had fallen asleep, I found Ethan standing alone on the covered terrace watching rain drift across the gardens. "Is everything all right?" I asked carefully. He was silent for a long moment before answering. Sometimes people pay attention to families for reasons that have nothing to do with kindness. His voice remained calm, yet I understood more than he actually said. "Are Liam and Sophie safe?" I asked. He turned toward me without hesitation. "They are my highest priority." I believed him immediately. The following morning, I decided to keep our routine as normal as possible. We baked muffins, practiced spelling words, and built a cardboard castle in the playroom. Just before lunch, the lights flickered briefly before returning to normal. Sophie instinctively reached for my hand. Liam looked toward the hallway, uncertain for the first time in days. I knelt beside them both and smiled. "How about we finish decorating the castle before lunch?" They nodded, comforted more by familiar routine than explanations. As they reached for markers and stickers, I silently promised myself something I had never expected to feel. Whatever uncertainty surrounded this family, I would do everything within my power to make sure these 2 children never lost the peace they had finally begun to find. The cardboard castle remained standing in the middle of the playroom for 3 days because neither Liam nor Sophie wanted to take it apart. Every room inside had been decorated with tiny drawings, paper stars, and handwritten signs that only children could invent. Liam called it Fortress Hope. Sophie insisted every castle needed a bakery because heroes became hungry too. I laughed more during those afternoons than I had in the previous year of my life. For a little while, the worries lingering around the estate seemed farther away. Then everything shifted again. Early one morning, Ethan canceled the children's piano lesson without explanation. The security team quietly changed our usual walking route through the gardens. Even the cheerful housekeeper glanced toward the windows more often than before. Nobody appeared frightened. They were simply careful. I reminded myself not to let the children absorb the tension surrounding the adults. They deserved one more ordinary day. We decided to have a picnic beside the old oak tree instead. Sophie carefully arranged sandwiches on a blanket while Liam challenged me to identify clouds shaped like animals. The sky was bright blue, and a soft breeze carried the scent of fresh grass across the lawn. It felt impossible that anything could interrupt such a peaceful afternoon. Then one of the security officers approached us with unusual urgency. His voice remained respectful, but his smile had disappeared. "Miss Bennett, Mr. Moretti would like everyone back inside now." Liam looked disappointed. "But we just got here." Before I could answer, another guard appeared several yards away, quietly directing the household staff toward the mansion. Nobody ran. Nobody shouted. Yet everyone moved with unmistakable purpose. I smiled at the children as though nothing unusual had happened. "Looks like we will finish our picnic indoors today." Sophie slipped her small hand into mine, while Liam gathered the blanket without complaining. We had almost reached the back terrace when Sophie suddenly stopped walking. Her stuffed rabbit had fallen beside the swing. "Bunny," she whispered. Before anyone else could react, she turned and hurried back across the grass. My heart jumped. I followed immediately, calling her name with as much calm as I could manage. By the time I reached her, she was already hugging the toy tightly against her chest. I knelt beside her, brushing a few strands of blonde hair away from her face. "Next time we stay together, okay?" She nodded and wrapped one arm around my neck. When I stood and turned back toward the house, Ethan was already crossing the lawn faster than I had ever seen him move. The moment his eyes found Sophie safely in my arms, the tension across his face eased. He stopped only a few feet away, looking first at his daughter, then at me. "Are you both all right?" he asked quietly. "We are fine," I answered. Sophie lifted her rabbit toward him with complete innocence. "I forgot Bunny." Ethan smiled gently before kissing the top of her head. Then he looked at me again, gratitude replacing the worry that had filled his eyes only moments earlier. Later that evening, after the children had fallen asleep, he found me in the library. The room was silent except for the crackling fireplace. "Today reminded me of something," he said. I looked up from the storybook I had been putting away. His voice was steady, but deeply personal. "For years, I believed protecting my children meant building stronger walls around them. You showed me that sometimes the greatest protection is the person who makes them feel safe enough to keep smiling." For the first time since I had arrived, I realized I was no longer simply caring for this family. Somewhere along the way, they had quietly become part of mine. Edit the conversation Ethan and I shared in the library stayed with me long after the fire had faded into glowing embers. For the first time since arriving at the estate, I allowed myself to imagine what life might look like if I simply stayed. The children had become part of my daily heartbeat. Liam no longer checked the front door every evening to see who might leave next. Sophie had stopped asking whether I would still be there in the morning. Those tiny changes mattered more than any paycheck ever could. That was exactly why I knew I had to make the hardest decision of all. The tension surrounding the estate had not disappeared. It had only become quieter, hidden behind polite smiles and carefully planned routines. I could accept uncertainty for myself, but I could not bear the thought of becoming another reason these children might one day feel afraid. Early the next morning, I folded my clothes into the same suitcase I had carried through the front gates weeks before. Somehow it felt heavier now. Every sweater carried memories instead of fabric. Every book reminded me of bedtime stories. Every pair of shoes remembered running through rain with two laughing children. I placed a handwritten letter on the bedroom desk, thanking Ethan for his kindness and explaining that Liam and Sophie deserved a future untouched by complications connected to me. Before anyone else woke up, I quietly carried my suitcase downstairs. I almost reached the front entrance before I heard a sleepy voice behind me. "Miss Claire." I turned slowly. Liam stood at the bottom of the staircase wearing mismatched pajamas, his hair still messy from sleep. Sophie appeared seconds later, rubbing her eyes while holding her stuffed rabbit close against her chest. They looked from my suitcase to my face without saying a word. Then Sophie began to cry. Not Elle. The suitcase never made it past the front door. By the time the sun climbed above the trees surrounding the estate, my clothes had been unpacked and folded back into the dresser as though they had never left. Nobody celebrated the decision with dramatic speeches. Life simply continued, but somehow everything felt lighter. At breakfast, Sophie carefully slid an extra blueberry pancake onto my plate because she said family members always shared. Liam proudly announced that Fortress Hope needed one final addition. When I asked what it was, he smiled and answered, "Someone who never leaves." I laughed, but I could not stop my eyes from filling with tears. Weeks slowly turned into months. The heavy silence that had once filled every hallway disappeared piece by piece. The kitchen became the busiest room in the house. Sunday mornings meant pancakes, cinnamon rolls, and flour covering nearly every countertop. Friday evenings became movie nights with oversized blankets spread across the family room floor. Ethan attended whenever his schedule allowed, sometimes arriving halfway through the film carrying bowls of fresh popcorn that Sophie insisted always tasted better when he made them. Liam grew more confident with every passing week. His teachers commented that he smiled more often and volunteered answers in class instead of sitting quietly in the back. Sophie stopped carrying her stuffed rabbit everywhere because she no longer felt the need to hold on to something for comfort every minute of the day. Even the staff changed. They laughed openly. They decorated the house for birthdays. They greeted one another by first names instead of formal titles. It was as though kindness had quietly become contagious. One crisp autumn afternoon, we gathered beneath the old oak tree where Liam had once flown higher than he thought possible on the wooden swing. The flowers we planted together months earlier had grown into bright patches of color stretching across the garden. Ethan carried a small wooden frame wrapped in simple brown paper. Without saying much, he handed it to me. Inside was the drawing Liam had made in the library that afternoon so many weeks ago, for people standing beneath the same oak tree. But one small detail had changed. Sophie had added a golden retriever beside us with bright purple ears because she believed every happy family deserved a silly dog someday. Across the bottom of the page, Liam had written carefully in neat block letters, "Home is the place where people keep choosing each other." I looked up, unable to speak. Ethan smiled with the quiet warmth I had come to know so well. "The frame belongs to you," he said. "The picture belongs to all of us." As evenings settled across the estate, we shared dinner around the kitchen island instead of the enormous formal table that had once felt so empty. There was laughter over burned dinner rolls, playful debates about whose turn it was to wash dishes, and Sophie's determined attempt to convince everyone that dessert should count as a vegetable. I realized then that I had arrived believing I was accepting another temporary job. Instead, I had walked into a family that had been waiting for hope without realizing it. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive with perfect timing or extraordinary promises. Sometimes they begin with one ordinary decision, one frightened heart willing to stay, and one home finally learning that love is not measured by the walls that protect us, but by the people who choose to remain inside them.